Hello to everyone who is back and joining us again for the webinar that we are going to present today. I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to introduce the webinar and introduce Felix and Susan, our PLG members, who are going to be presenting alongside me today. So the webinar today is Supporting Two-Spirit, Non-Binary, and Trans Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence. We are really glad that you're back here and taking the time to join us and learn with us through this webinar. And I'm just going to pull it up for you and then we will get going. So for those of you who are maybe just joining us or weren't able to join us in the session prior, my name is Maisha. I'm the project coordinator with the TransFormed project. And I'm joined here today with Felix Kane and Susan Lgbtqa, who are peer leadership members and who are also presenting alongside me for this webinar. Sorry, folks, just a second. My screen is being funny. Okay, I may stop the screen sharing and then start it again. I think something has frozen for me, unfortunately. Sorry, bear with me. Thank you for your patience. Okay, I think it's okay now. I'm so sorry. Thank you. The order of things got mixed up. So actually, I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement again before I get into the introductions for Felix and Susan. METRAC's board of directors and staff are committed to upholding the spirit and intent of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations and call to action. To this end, at the beginning of all METRAC meetings, we make a statement through which we hope to raise awareness, understanding, and respect for the traditional Indigenous territories of Ontario. We recognize the traditional Indigenous territories on which our organization is located and on which our programs and trainings take place. We recognize the failure of settlers to uphold Indigenous sovereignty of this land, and we commit to decolonize our organization on an ongoing basis and bring this history to light. For thousands of years, this land has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by Upper Canada treaties. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, as in the Haudenosaunee word Toronto, is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth and for the resources we are using, and honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who have been living on this land. We are aware that our settler acknowledgement uses language which may differ from language used by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. We understand that language is fluid and living, and we respect this diversity. We are also aware that not all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit refer to themselves in the same way. Some may refer to themselves in spiritual or religious contexts, while others may use regional names. So I'd like to begin by introducing Felix Kane, who uses they, them pronouns. Felix is an androgynous, non-binary, transgender educator, artist, and advocate who centers much of their life's work around furthering understanding, inclusion, and developing resources for gender diverse communities. For over a decade, they have done advocacy around combating rape culture and intimate partner violence, which has provided them with a multifaceted and nuanced view of lateral violence and systemic oppression. In their work, they have coined the phrase coercively feminized to give language to the specific oppressions faced by AFAB, assigned female at birth, non-binary, transgender, and gender diverse people without appropriating or downplaying the severity of other terminology. They hold an ever-growing respect for the philosophy of restorative and transformative justice and believe it will be a vital component in addressing harm both within and directed at gender diverse communities. Susan Gapka uses she, her, and L. Susan is a member of TransFormed's People with Lived Experience group. Susan is also a founding member and chair of the Toronto Trans Coalition Project, which recently produced From Surviving to Thriving, a needs assessment of trans and non-binary people in Toronto based on the social determinants of health. Previously, Susan helped to lead the trans lobby group's Ontario campaign to fund transition-related surgeries, helped change the Vital Statistics Act so trans people's legal documents more accurately reflect their lived identity, and drafted the legislation to amend the Ontario Human Rights Code and Canadian Human Rights Act to include gender identity and gender expression. Thank you, Susan and Felix, for being here. And there's me. I use they, them, theirs. I have a cheeky little example of how I use my pronouns that I like to send to people. So I am the project coordinator for this project here at METRAC. I initially started as a PLG member and then moved on to work as a coordinator in early February to assist our former coordinator, Tatiana Ferguson. Alongside working in community work and organizing, I am really passionate about the arts. I hold a Bachelor of Fine Arts from York in film production. And when I'm not writing or working on set, I'm working really hard to unlearn and learn, educate myself, and be more active and participate in either leading community events or just being a participant. So I'm going to talk a little bit about METRAC and the TransFormed project, and then get into some of the overview and objectives before we begin with the rest of the webinar. METRAC was founded in 1984 and is a not-for-profit agency based in the Greater Toronto Area. METRAC has historically been devoted to advancing safety, justice, and equity for women and youth. But with the introduction and creation of the TransFormed project, METRAC has expanded its inclusivity efforts by putting time, energy, and research into understanding the experiences of intimate partner violence within two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. METRAC is committed to partnering with individuals, communities, and institutions to change ideas, actions, and policies towards ending gender-based violence. The TransFormed project is a bilingual community-based research project that is led by METRAC in partnership with Centre de Francophone. So over the past 3 years, the TransFormed project has engaged in community-based participatory research and education with the goal of addressing barriers and increasing access to health and social supports for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people who are affected by intimate partner violence. One of the ways we are working towards our goal of greater access and better supports for survivors is through utilizing education initiatives such as this webinar to increase the capacity of service providers to better support community members who have experienced intimate partner violence. Before we begin, we'd like to take time to thank our partners again, Centre de Francophone, the TransFormed Peer Leadership Group, our former coordinator, Tatiana Ferguson, and the funders as well, the Public Health Canada, City of Toronto, Department of Justice, and the Law Foundation. I also want to thank all the METRAC staff who helped in editing this webinar and looking through it over the past year. Laura, Wendy, Kitty, everyone, Paola, who provided so much support in us getting here. We wouldn't be here without them. It really is a team effort, so I'm very thankful for that. We also want to thank the Knowledge Hub and Violence Against Women Learning Network for helping to promote the webinar with service providers around Canada. So this webinar is part one of a two-part series for service providers on supporting two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people affected by intimate partner violence. In today's webinar, we are going to start by taking a look at who participated in our research project. So we are going to be sharing information about relationships within two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, research on prevalence and types of violence that folks within these communities are experiencing within their relationships, some of the barriers that survivors from these communities face that make it difficult to access supports or services. And finally, we are going to be talking about some of the ways that you and your organization can provide supports or services that are inclusive and meet the needs of community members. So I will hand it over to Felix to get us started on understanding gender and sexual orientation.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted.
Okay.
The wonders of Zoom never gets old. So understanding gender and sexual orientation. As we move into examining the research from the TransFormed project, let's begin by discussing the importance of language and the ways in which community members identify themselves. A commitment to gender inclusivity begins with service providers understanding the language that community members use to help create safer spaces. Language is always changing, and that's a positive thing. It is constantly evolving and shifting to be more inclusive of the various community members. This encourages people to find self-empowerment through describing themselves in their unique intersections. It is important as service providers to do your best to keep up to date with the current terminology and seek accurate and appropriate resources for clarification when needed. This is an important part of building genuinely safer and more inclusive spaces in the healthcare and social service sectors, so that the needs of your gender diverse community members can be met. So awareness is not only about being up to date with information and terminology, it is also about being thoughtful of how you address someone. This means being aware of things like pronouns, how you associate physical appearances and characteristics with certain genders, and checking your internal biases around expectations and how you perceive people based on their presentation, or more accurately, how you perceive their presentation. As we take a look at the spectrum of gender and sexual identities represented in this research and within gender diverse communities, we will share some basic information with you and encourage you to visit some other resources, such as our glossary, if you're seeking more information. The TransFormed Glossary, which is a comprehensive listing of terms and definitions used in this project, is available for you and your organization. You can find it on the Metrax TransFormed project page. If you go to the Metrax website, you can look under the heading "What We Do" and you'll find the TransFormed project. TransFormed project has taken place over the past 3 years. Due to the lack of data on intimate partner violence and the prevalence within impacts on two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, the TransFormed study engaged over 150 community members on this topic. This study included an online survey, focus groups, and individual interviews, the results of which we will be examining throughout this webinar. This research project was made possible through the leadership and support of members of the peer leadership group, who all identify as members of the two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. So, community members participating in this study were able to self-identify their gender or genders from a list of options. Here's a look at who responded to the survey. 48% identified as non-binary. So for those of you who don't know, non-binary is both a gender and an umbrella term for genders that do not exist rigidly within the gender binary. Non-binary identities are varied and can include people who identify with some aspects of the gender binary, while others reject the binary entirely. Our survey did not ask for data around assigned sex or gender at birth, which is which we acknowledge has an impact on the statistical analysis across the varied non-binary experiences, and has ultimately impacted our capacity to collect data on coercively feminized experiences. Trans is an umbrella term that refers to people with diverse gender identities and expressions that differ from stereotypical gender norms. 20% of the survey participants identified as trans women. A trans woman is a woman who identifies as a woman but was assigned male at birth and identifies as being a woman or being femme or feminine. 20% of survey participants identified as trans men. A trans man is a person who was assigned female at birth but identifies as a man or being masc or masculine. 6% of survey respondents identified as two-spirit. The term two-spirit is a culturally specific term exclusive to Indigenous people. It refers to a person who has both a masculine and feminine spirit and is used by some First Nations people to describe their sexual, gender, or spiritual identity. 4% identified as gender questioning, meaning that they are a person who is exploring their gender identity in ways that feel affirming. 15% identified as gender nonconforming, which means individuals who do not conform to the stereotypical expectations of their genders. They may identify themselves or express themselves as feminine men, masculine women, or as androgynous or outside of the categories of boy, man, or girl, woman. People who are gender nonconforming may or may not identify as trans or non-binary. It is important to mention that being gender nonconforming is not inherently non-binary trans. Cisgender people can also be gender nonconforming. Additionally, being gender nonconforming does not depend on perceived external presentation. And additionally, 21% identified with a gender that was not listed. So in the survey, participants were asked to self-identify their sexual orientation and were able to select more than one option. Here's a look at how people responded. 44 identified as queer, 23 identified as pansexual, 21 were bisexual, 10% were heterosexual, 9% were asexual, 8% were lesbian, and 6% were gay. It is important to note that two-spirit, non-binary, and trans folks identified across a diverse spectrum of genders and sexualities. To be able to effectively serve clients from gender-diverse communities who are facing violence, it is important to understand how people identify, both in terms of their gender and their sexual or romantic orientations, which are different aspects of a person's identity. One aspect does not rely on the other. Gender identity is a person's primary sense of gender. A person's gender identity informs their sense of being a man, a woman, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. Sexual and romantic orientations are a person's sense of sexual, romantic, or intimate attraction. Now we'll move on to Susan.
Thank you, Felix. We're going to now talk about relationships in two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. Now that we have a sense of who participated in the research and the diversity of gender and sexual identities within the communities we worked with, we can move into talking about what the research tells us about relationships and relationship violence as experienced by community members. As we just discussed, participants in the survey identified with a variety of sexual and romantic orientations across the spectrum and identified as being engaged in a variety of different relationships. For many people within these communities, dating and relationships can be as daunting as coming out about their gender identity or transitioning into their gender identity. Individuals may struggle with self-acceptance and finding a partner who appreciates them as they are. Some challenges that typically prevent many two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people from finding and maintaining healthy, loving relationships include gender dysphoria, transition, disclosure, and acceptance. Gender dysphoria is when a person's gender is not aligning socially and or physically with their identity. This would include experiencing gender dysphoria when being misgendered, or their body not aligning with how they feel internally about their gender. Transitioning refers to a range of physical, social, legal, or medical changes that a person might undergo to affirm their gender identity. Disclosure is the process of disclosure is the process of someone sharing their identity as a two-spirit, trans or non-binary person, and finding acceptance for who they are. Furthermore, there can be a challenge of feeling desirable and valued in intimate relationships, whether that is privately within the relationship or out in public. It is about wanting to be seen, recognized, and desired as a whole person, including all aspects of one's identity, including gender identity and expression. Despite these challenges, people still desire and engage in relationships like everyone else. It is also important to recognize the aforementioned challenges and the actual dynamics at play within those relationships, which are often unique to these specific communities. While individuals' preferences will of course vary for each person, it is important to know and understand different types of relationships that people are engaged in. When asked about their relationship status in the research, we can see that respondents shared a range of relationship statuses. 35% reported being single, 24% were dating, 21% said they were married, 14% identified open and or polyamorous relationships, and 1% said they were divorced. Many people did identify with engaging in monogamous relationships in the study. And monogamy is the practice of having an intimate, romantic, or sexual relationship with only one partner at a time. However, the findings suggest a growing number of people in two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities are involved in relationships that include open, polyamorous, triads, and otherwise non-monogamous relationships. While some of these relationships may appear similar or straight to monogamous relationships, the roles and expectations may differ dramatically depending on the people involved. An open relationship, as its title suggests, is a relationship whereby partners involved agree to openly date other people. They may all agree to openly date other people or agree together that one of them is okay to do so. The terms of the agreement often vary and may allow for one or more partners to be sexually, emotionally, or physically involved with other people. Polyamorous relationships are relationships where the people involved are able to have romantic or sexual relationships with more than one person, with the awareness and consent of all people involved. Many structures and forms of polyamory exist. A triad is a group of 3 people involved in an intimate relationship. While there are many different types of relationships that people in two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities might be involved in, it is important to know that regardless of our relationship type, no one person should be subjected to violence or abuse. When providing support around relationship violence to two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, it is important for service providers to inquire about the relationship type, number of people involved, and the relationship dynamics, as each individual's needs will be different. Inquiring into these details requires a consistent reaffirmation of safety, confidentiality, and understanding, as clients may have had negative experiences around disclosing these details about their relationships in the past. Now I'm going to pass it over to Maisha for the next section.
Thank you, Susan. So the next section is taking a look at intimate partner violence within two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. So data from the TransFormed study indicated that over 80% of participants experienced IPV in their lifetime, while 44% of participants experienced intimate partner violence in the past 2 years. 40% of people believed that the violence they experienced was because of their gender identity or expression. Trans women are at a greater risk for experiencing relationship violence due to trans misogyny. Black trans women are at a particularly high risk because of trans misogyny and anti-Black racism. As mentioned earlier, the survey did not collect data around coercively feminized people, and thus the study can't speak to the prevalence or impacts of coercive feminization, especially within racialized communities. We acknowledge that this specific intersection is newer language and that the ideas behind them have been long overlooked in various areas of research. It is clear that people within two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities are experiencing high levels of violence within their relationships. It's important to note that due to the vast diversity of sexual orientations that are represented in the study, community members may experience violence while dating people of the same or different gender. So these experiences of violence may be elevated when multiple partners are involved in the relationship. While our study didn't inquire about the gender of the respondents' partners, our literature did identify that trans women, particularly those who are in relationships with cisgender men or women, are especially vulnerable to abuse. So ahead of you, you'll be able to see some of the specific sections and the percentages attached to it. So for example, 85.7% of our participants stated that they experienced emotional abuse. So examples are insults, put downs, limiting your contact with others, threatening to hurt you, or damaging your property. 44% of participants said that they experienced gender identity abuse. Examples are not acknowledging your gender identity, or taking away hormones or medication, or threatening to out you. 32.1% said that they faced financial abuse. Some examples are preventing you from knowing about or having access to your income, or forcing you to give money, or forcing you to give possessions or property. 40.5% said that they experienced physical abuse, such as being physically hurt. 51.2% said that they experienced sexual abuse. So examples are forcing you to have sex or engaging in sexual behaviors without your freely given and informed consent. And I just want to think of our past meetings when Felix has mentioned the term enthusiastic consent. So I just want to mention that as well. 22.6% reported cyber harassment. So examples of that are sending or threatening to send sexual photos of you. And 19% stated other forms of abuse that we didn't directly list, such as social abuse, racialized abuse, and forms of ghosting. In particular, many people did express experiencing feelings of neglect and exploitation within their relationships, which do get amplified by the trauma and violence that is experienced during sexual relationships prior to the ones that they're currently in, during or after transitioning. There are a lot of specific factors such as immigration, language, income status, mental health, physical health, trauma, discrimination, and more that influence how two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people experience relationships. It's really important for service providers to be aware of these many different facets of a client's identity. Respondents share that the violence that they experienced was amplified by forms of oppression, including among these, race, homophobia, ableism, and poverty. 45% of respondents said that they had experiences of transphobia on a regular basis, and 36% reported multiple forms of discrimination. 17% reported engaging in unwanted sex in exchange for food, money, or a place to stay. Another thing that's really important for service providers to be aware of are some of the particular forms of relationship violence that community members experience. So, such as ignoring or insulting the person's gender identity, ignoring that or misgendering them, gender policing, which is controlling how you should present your gender identity, outing you, body shaming, such as telling someone that their body is wrong or weird in some way, dead naming, which is sharing information related to someone's past experiences of their gender, of their name, or any other information without their consent. It's also the refusal to use appropriate pronouns or the name that they want you to use. And it's not mentioned on the slide here, but I want to include that reproductive abuse was also mentioned. So examples are sabotaging birth control, attempting to coerce someone into unwanted pregnancy, because that was reported in our findings. And I'm going to pass it on to Felix to get deeper into some of the impacts of violence.
All right. So, looking at the impacts of violence. Experiencing relationship violence can have serious and wide-ranging impacts on all aspects of a person, physically, emotionally, psychologically, financially, sexually, spiritually, and so on. Let's take a look at some of the specific impacts of this violence has on individuals within gender diverse communities. So 38.1% of survey participants reported physical health problems. 89.3% identified as having mental health problems or psychological distress. 41.7% used substances to cope. 36.9% reported family problems. 9.5% reported child welfare involvement. 41.7% experienced housing issues. 10.7% experienced legal problems. 33.3% reported work problems. 1.2% faced immigration problems. 45.3% experienced financial problems. 28.6% experienced spiritual or cultural problems. 10.7% noted that they had experienced an impact not listed, such as suicide, delayed transition, and isolation, and so on. Only 4.8% of respondents reported having no impacts from experiencing violence. So considering the prevalence of experiencing intimate partner violence within two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, the serious impacts of this violence has on an individual, and the multiple forms of discrimination that people are experiencing, it is not surprising that 60% of respondents expressed that partner violence in the two-spirit, non-binary, and trans community was a major problem that needs to be addressed. Participants in the research share specific suggestions on how we can increase awareness of partner violence within these communities, to potentially reduce the prevalence of relationship violence, and to also increase the supports available to gender diverse survivors. These suggestions are what we will be exploring in the next sections of the webinar. And I'll pass it over to Susan.
Thank you, Felix, again. Now we're going to talk about barriers to seeking support. Before we get to sharing the suggestions that participants gave on what service providers can do to make their services more inclusive and supportive of two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people, it is important to share some of the significant barriers that participants identified that prevent or make it very difficult for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people to reach out and get support. Intersectionality and barriers. First of all, let's take a look at some of the interesting aspects of individuals' identities that create barriers to accessing services and support. 31.7% identified chronic long-term illness as a barrier, 19% a physical disability, 9.5% a sensory disability. That would be hearing or vision loss, for example. 12.7% identified a developmental disability, and 17.5% had a learning disability. Now here's a interesting statistic. 74.6% identified a mental health issue as a barrier. None reported no conditions that were a barrier, and not listed but identified in a write-in category, 17.5% identified income as a barrier to accessing services. 75% of respondents are facing mental health challenges and many different forms of disability that create barriers to accessing services and supports. People are experiencing lack of financial resources. These challenges are all layered with forms of discrimination that people are facing as a result of transphobia, racism, homophobia, classism, ableism, audism, and sexism. This complexity of people's experiences demonstrates the need for service providers to be aware of multiple systems of oppression that impact an individual's experience of violence and access to support. Resources are not always responsive to the needs of gender diverse communities. As we spoke about earlier in this webinar, it is imperative that service providers understand that gender is different from sexual and romantic orientation, and often the needs of two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people are unmet because most service providers do not know how to respond to individuals identifying in these communities. 33% of respondents in the survey mentioned that resources were not responsive to their specific needs as a two-spirit, non-binary, and/or trans person. When elaborating, some respondents stated that they would like to know what providers or counselors are actively working on to be inclusive of the wide-ranging needs of the community, learning and unlearning, doing the work on a regular basis to spread inclusive, anti-oppressive policies throughout their organization, making amends for mistakes, as this shows a commitment to serving our community's needs wholly. Now back over to Felix for the next section.
All right. So the next section is a lack of awareness of supports and long wait times. This was a noted problem. Key informants are representatives from organizations that serve two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people who gave interviews and sat on our advisory committees throughout the research project. These key informants shared that there was a lack of awareness on what resources are available for folks within these communities. Participants in the survey confirmed this, as 21% shared that they did not know of any resources or supports they could access. Despite the lack of information and resources being readily available to community members, respondents did access some support, some resources to help with their relationship concerns. 84, a vast majority of respondents accessed mental health supports and counseling to improve their relationships. 62% of respondents opted for self-help resources. However, a large number of people expressed concerns that the waitlist for counseling services were too long, with 32% reporting that there was a waitlist to access to support. Another issue was social isolation. 53.4% of respondents reported that they were lacking companionship very often or often. 46.1% reported feeling left out very often or often. And 54% reported feeling isolated often or very often. Fear and a lack of trust in the system was also highlighted. One of the greatest barriers to accessing services and supports when experiencing violence was the fear of being misgendered by service providers. Being misgendered is an incredibly invalidating experience and can cause a wide range of psychological, mental, and emotional issues for gender diverse people. It is imperative for service providers and organizations to create environments where staff are actively aware of the particular needs and issues faced by two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. Not only should organizations be promoting awareness within their staff teams, they should also be engaging in ongoing assessments of their workplace policies and procedures to ensure that they are inclusive and promoting access to gender diverse individuals. Continuous assessments that are actively communicated through all levels of management and staff have been proven to be the most effective method of creating long-term change in businesses and organizations. Respondents expressed a lack of trust using resources and supports, with 32% sharing that they did not trust the services to meet their needs. 31% of participants shared that they had a negative experience using resources and supports in the past. The serious fear of disclosing one's gender identity to service providers and the lack of trust that services will meet their needs, layered on top of the complexity of other concurrent challenges faced by individuals within gender diverse communities, most notably mental health challenges, a lack of financial resources, housing issues and substance use, are all overlapping to create further vulnerability to violence while preventing these communities from accessing services and support. On to Maisha.
Thank you. So this final portion of the webinar is taking a look at creating safer and inclusive supports for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans survivors. Given the myriad of challenges that community members are facing and the barriers to accessing services and supports, we want to think about what can we as service providers do to create safer, more accessible, and appropriate supports for folks who are experiencing violence within two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. So the first thing we want to take a look at is inclusive language. As we discussed at the start of today's webinar, a commitment to gender inclusivity starts with understanding the language that community members use and creating a safer space for folks. For every sector, whether it's healthcare, the anti-violence sector, the mental health sector, or etc., we are hearing from community members that if appropriate language is used when planning, developing, and promoting programs, then this will help to increase access to programs and result in having a greater impact on two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. As we mentioned earlier, language is constantly changing, so it is important that you do your best to stay up to date with the language that community members are using. We developed the TransFormed Glossary so that it can be used as a companion piece, as a guide to support frontline workers who are new to working with two-spirit, non-binary, and trans community members. Raising awareness within your organization about the importance of using appropriate language and building rapport and trust with clients by respecting and affirming their gender identity really is an integral first step in creating more gender inclusive supports. Participants in our project also suggested some operational changes that people can work on within their organizations who are seeking to better support community members.
So, Creating gender inclusive policies. As previously highlighted, many two-spirit, non-binary, and trans survivors of violence may be unsure of whether your services are responsive to their particular needs. Creating and implementing gender inclusion policies will help to reassure and demonstrate to survivors that the space is safer and welcoming to their gender. A safer space is a space that is affirming and welcoming to members of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. As a guideline, these policies should include options for self-identification on intake forms. It is very important that people are able to self-determine and identify their own gender and pronouns, especially with service providers during the intake and registration process. Self-determination of gender allows individuals to maintain autonomy over their identities, since an important part of independence is the dignity and the ability to make choices. Regardless of surgical or medical options, two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people in Ontario theoretically have the option of deciding how they would like to identify on provincial and federal documents. This includes on forms, identity documents, and while accessing services. With that said, non-binary people are still fighting for genuine representation on documents, as the X markers are currently only superficial, meaning that while anyone can get an X marker, their assigned gender is held on file. As an additional note, Bill C-16, which is the Gender Identity Bill, was passed in the Senate in June of 2017. This federal bill has contributed to human rights protections for gender diverse people in the Canadian Human Rights Act and Criminal Code. Having visible and printed resources for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans folks is an important method of visually signaling to these communities that your services are responsive to their particular needs. Having protocols on client-staff interactions relating to disclosures of gender identity is also helpful. The fear of being misgendered was a major barrier that is preventing folks from accessing services. It is integral that organizations have clear policies and procedures for staff on how to interact with clients in ways that affirm and validate disclosures of gender identity and pronouns. Challenging biases and assumptions around gender and presentation within service provision and by service providers is also a must. These often unconscious biases create barriers that are preventing folks from feeling safe enough to come forward and seek support. Organizations must commit to creating policies and practices that are respectful and affirming to all gender identities. Protocols on addressing transphobic, homophobic, and oppressive behavior is also recommended. Many folks in the research identified as having had experiences of discrimination. Organizations must have clear policies and protocols that address discrimination in order to create safer environments for community members to access. Having accessible bathrooms and communal spaces for folks of all genders is important, as is having gender inclusive programs. In consultations with key informants, the TransFormed study identified that services and supports which are segregated by sex can create uncomfortable environment for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people. Services and supports offered for cisgender heterosexual women may not meet the needs of trans femmes, non-binary, or coercively feminized people, as the programming may not take into consideration the varied experiences and challenges that affect the community members who don't identify as cisgender. These services may place people who are seeking help in an environment where they may be misgendered, harassed, or bullied. As you may recall, we mentioned that 31% of participants shared that they had a negative experience using resources and supports in the past. Creating gender-inclusive programming is one important way to ensure that services are able to provide a more positive experience. Additionally, there is a lack of services and supports available to trans men and trans masculine individuals in particular, since our understandings of intimate partner violence is so heavily gendered. Another way to create more inclusive supports is to engage specific outreach to two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. As you integrate these policy changes and new practices in your organization, it will be important to let these communities know that your programs are aiming to be inclusive and appropriate. Key informants identified a lack of resources as a major problem to supporting two-spirit, non-binary, and trans clients. Respondents confirmed this finding, with 21% noting that they did not know of many resources or supports. It will be important for organizations who are committed to serving gender diverse clients to engage in outreach to communities, to let them know of the resources and supports that are available and that will meet their specific needs as gender diverse people. I also it's not mentioned here, but I did want to reference the Toronto Shelter Network. They recently released a report regarding gender diversity and access within the shelter system. It is available on their website, and it includes a sample of an updated SMIS intake form with a gender inclusive field. So your organization may want to use that as a point of reference when recreating accessible intake processes. And I'll pass it to Susan.
Well, thank you, Felix. And now we're going to talk about commitment to diversity and visibility. Many participants in our research mention the need for more visibility and peer-led programs within organizations providing services to the two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. To show your commitment to diversity, we suggest incorporating peer-led approaches, recruiting and hiring from these communities, inviting two-spirit, non-binary, and trans folks to join your boards of directors, and advocating for gender inclusion within your networks. Respondents agreed that peer-led approaches developed by people with lived experience was one ideal solution. Participants expressed an interest in group discussions and workshops or more focus group settings. Part 2 of this webinar series on Thursday will focus specifically on how organizations can integrate peer-led approaches in their services to build resiliency among two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people. Data collected from the TransFormed study highlights the need for service providers to have access to training and resources for the diverse clients they serve. Organizations should commit to strengthening the capacity of their staff teams by promoting a culture of ongoing learning. Participants in the research clearly identified the need for service providers to have a greater awareness about the unique needs of two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people. They suggested ongoing training in order for providers and services to be better equipped to support community members. In our survey, participants noted that they desired services that were understanding to the specific nature of abuse within the 2S LGBTQA+ community, including awareness of specific sensitivities that must be taken into consideration. For example, having the awareness and skills to support Black, Indigenous, people of color, clients, which requires awareness of how to create cultural safety and adopting a trauma-informed lens. According to the Center for Disease Control, adopting a trauma-informed approach is not accomplished through any singular particular technique or checklist. It requires constant attention, caring awareness, sensitivity, and possibly a cultural change at an organizational level. ongoing internal organizational assessment and quality improvement, engagement with community stakeholders will help to embed this approach. Service providers should also seek opportunities to engage in continuous learning about the diverse issues that affect communities, thereby building competency to support survivors from groups disproportionately affected by violence. Now we're going to hand it over for the end of this webinar. Over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, this brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for those who stuck around to hear it all the way, to view it all the way through. We really hope it's given you some insight into the experiences of Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, and that you're leaving with additional knowledge and tools to help you and your organizations engage in this important work of creating more inclusive, accessible, and appropriate supports. Similar to what you saw today with day one, we would love for you to complete that evaluation, but we have a specific evaluation that is catered to webinar one. It would be really helpful for us to get your feedback on what your experience was like viewing the information that we provided and how you feel about what you learned today. So please do take some time whenever you are free to go onto these links and do these evaluations. They're really beneficial to us, and they support us in making sure future programming or content is improved based on your feedback and recommendations. As Susan mentioned, our next webinar is on Thursday, and it's taking a deeper look at developing peer-led interventions for Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans communities as expressed by those who participated in our surveys, focus groups, and individual interviews. So we really hope you can join us on day 3 to view this last webinar. And we have a couple of minutes, so I'm going to take some time to try and access the Q&A to see if folks have any questions that were left unanswered. And similarly to what I said earlier, if you find that you have questions coming up later on, don't hesitate to email us. We will gladly get back to you and try to get you whatever information that you're looking for. So
I might, oh, there's just 2 questions, Maisha. Can you see them?
yes, yeah. And I will also invite Susan and Felix to have, if you have any answers for these questions as well. So one of them is, some organizations ask people what their pronouns are, but can't this be triggering for people who worked hard to present as their gender?
I can take this one if you'd like.
Yeah, let's do Felix, and then I think I saw Susan had something to say too. So we'll do Felix and then Susan.
Okay, so I would say that it really depends on how you go about it. Like if you're not asking every single person and you're signaling the person out, then you're effectively saying, hey, you don't pass. What are you? That can be received and justifiably so, and it's really uncomfortable when that happens. And trans people, especially trans femmes, are often singled out. A way of not doing that is to ask everyone. Be upfront about your pronouns, and when you introduce yourself, be like, hey, this is my name, these are my pronouns, and ask every single person. I think it's the singling out that makes trans people feel uncomfortable. And I would also invite people to think, or people who are bringing this up as an argument against asking for pronouns, to examine how this might pit non-binary and trans communities against each other. Because when we position this as don't ask for pronouns, we might offend binary trans people who try really hard to pass. We're effectively treating non-binary people as people who should just be accept being misgendered to make sure someone else isn't, or as someone's more comfortable. And that's not an okay request either. So I would recommend checking out the Toronto Shelter Network, that resources that was created, because that is a pretty comprehensive list, a comprehensive outline of how to ask for pronouns and gender in a way that is respectful and also accommodates people who maybe their English isn't their first language, or maybe they don't want to disclose. So yeah, I would recommend for anyone asking these questions to check out that report as well.
Thank you.
Well, you know, I related to the question because that's how I felt originally when my employer asked me to start using pronouns and sort of mandated I'm Susan identified. But because I thought it brought back a lot of, it singled me out, and that I thought we had gotten through identifying and being accepted publicly as who my authentic self as she, oh, let's use a pronoun, she, her, and le français. But I grew to understand how important it was by working with non-binary people, some people on this project and other projects. And one day I was asked at a provincial women's committee meeting if we were doing introductions, and the chair turns to me and says, "Do you want us to use pronouns?" And I thought, my first reaction was no. It brought up everything. And you know, I couldn't get it out of my mind for the rest of the day. And I showed up at the meeting on day 2 and I said, you know what, let's do that. And it's turned out to be, yes, I think I'm ready to do that, use pronouns. And some people did and some people didn't. And it's still the same way in that regard. But what I learned, it was an incredibly useful educational component that allies and other people could actually show their support for trans and non-binary people. And that, and I compare it to when I'm asked questions about it. It's like how we used to say husband and wife, but now we use partner. This is how you show support for a disadvantaged community. So I've actually gotten much more comfortable with it over the last few years. And you can see that it's in my, what do you call it? Beside my name in the panel, in the Hollywood Squares box. Thank you. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it was definitely helpful. Thank you, Susan. I think it's a great question. I see Natalia in the chat is saying that was not my intention. I'm actually non-binary. I just heard that argument from another person and was curious. I think it's a good question to ask. It's one that I've heard a lot before in the community. I want to say from a service provider and organizer perspective, I think it really depends on the context. So something that Felix mentioned, like really stating your pronouns first as a person in a position of leadership is setting that environment already and letting people know that this is a safer place for you to bring that up if you want to. Or yeah, if you're planning on asking someone, doing it in a way where everyone is like, everyone has to answer to that. So one person isn't singled out. I mentioned that the context is also important because if we're talking about something like intake forms, for example, that's really important to mention on there. Your pronouns are important because it's impacting how an organizer or service provider is providing a certain type of care or support for you. But in certain situations like workshops or programs, if you're an organizer, I would just ask you to think carefully about the intention of asking, and then, you know, as Susan and Felix mentioned, the various feelings that come up for people when you do, because you have to be prepared to do aftercare in that way for folks. So hopefully that kind of, all 3 of us are able to answer your question.
I would add to that, depending on context, like if, as you were like, just to build on what Maisha was saying, because like if you don't need to know someone's pronouns, don't ask. Like unless you're going to be potentially referring to them later, or if it's a discussion, having the option to opt in or opt out of sharing pronouns is also useful. But yeah, examine, like really kind of unpack why you're asking and if it's absolutely necessary to gather that information, because a lot of people will also feel a certain level of surveillance from that. And that can lead to some like not so great feelings either.
Yeah. There's one more question. So it's asking, are there any specific resources for 2S LGBTQA plus partners of those who are receiving court-mandated treatment for IPV. So I can read it again slower. Are there any specific resources for 2S LGBTQA plus partners of those who are receiving court-mandated treatment for IPV? So I guess it's resources for folks whose partners are receiving court-mandated treatment for IPV. I think in this context, I don't know of any like very specific resources that would be for partners who like are in relationships with folks who have been asked to go and partake in court-mandated treatment. I'm just thinking of like the general resources that are available to partners, and I wonder if that is still usable in that situation and context.
I know of St. Stephen's Community House. And I'm not sure if St. Felix as well, but I'm pretty sure St. Stephen's Community House has a restorative and transformative justice program. So if someone has perpetrated intimate partner violence or sexualized violence, or is a community conflict, they can request to have mediators help them through that process and navigate that. Is that what is being asked? I just want to clarify.
Yeah, I think just any type of specific resource for someone that knows somebody that's receiving that court context treatment. I think someone in the comments is offering something too. It says, Carla is saying usually court mandate programs, PARs, have a component of support for their partners. So I guess it seems like if someone is going through a court mandated treatment, there's also resources within that program that should be available to partners. So if you don't know about that, I would recommend asking the specific folks that you're working with, or the group that you're working with, or the people who are assigned to support your partner in that way, and ask, I also need support for myself and in supporting my partner. This is a really interesting question though. It was submitted anonymously. I would encourage you to maybe email me this question afterwards as well, because I'd love to look into it and find out, and then have that ready for others too if they ever ask. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I don't want to like say the wrong thing, but I'm thinking we really were specific about a huge gap in service for people who had lived experience of intimate partner violence, and because there were very little sources on that. So I haven't come across much. I haven't seen much myself. I don't think we really focused on that because we wanted to be there for the people, the two-spirit, non-binary and trans people themselves. And so that's what we were really focused on this project.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like there's also a conversation about, in relation to this question, types of mediation that are either like given or avoided due to like power imbalance that are stemming from different folks. I think I saw someone raise a hand. We don't have that option available right now, but if you're comfortable, you can ask what you were going to say in the Q&A or the chat, or if you're not, you can email us afterwards at transformedcoordinator2@medtrack.org. Okay, I don't see any more. Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, the email is in the chat. I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to wrap this webinar up and bring it to a close. Thank you so much to everyone who stayed to listen. This will be, to view. I should stop saying that. We'll note. This will be available on our webpage with the rest of the videos from day 1, day 2, day 3, and the webinar on Thursday after day 3 will also be available on the webpage. So if you want to view it again or view notes specifically, like written notes without the video, that will also be available on the webpage for you very shortly after we're done the symposium. Thank you again, everyone. I hope everyone has a safe night.
Just thinking that people can bring it back to their organizations as well.
Yeah.